Project Teams, Team Performance Domain, Part 1. For this particular topic, I will reference PMBOK 7 in a little bit more detail. The activities or the actions performed within the team performance domain have specific outcomes. And those outcomes are focused on shared ownership around the project itself, a high-performing team. It includes concepts around leadership and interpersonal skills. And the team performance domain entails the establishing of the culture, and it focuses also on the environment that enables the individuals to evolve into a high-performing project team. For the next few slides, I would like you to do a bit of a reflection. I want you to think back to instances within your team specific to the group project, where some of the aspects of team and team performance may have been or may not have been present, and some of the issues or the advantages that those presented to you. So, common aspects of team development include the following: a shared vision and objectives. In order for project teams to evolve into high-performing project teams, there has to be a clearly established vision and a clear set of objectives. Are all team members understanding of what it is that they're trying to achieve? Do they understand the objectives? Do they have that common sense of what the project is and what it is trying to achieve? Studies have shown that if the project itself is not well defined, if the project leader does not establish a clear vision, why does the project matter? What are we trying to achieve? What is the bigger picture with respect to the organization and the project outcomes or the objectives itself? How does it support the overall organizational strategy? Where does it fit in? Another area of concern is the establishment of clear roles and responsibilities. One of the areas within your project charter asked you as a project team to look at the scope of work, to clearly identify the types of roles that would be required to achieve the project outcomes, and the responsibilities that each individual project team member has. Then there are project team operations, essentially the operating principles or the ways of working that are necessary for the team to be able to perform and execute project activities. These can include templates, can include processes, and so forth. A team also needs guidance. With project management and projects that are geared towards a waterfall methodology, the project manager is a centralized point of command. They ensure that the team is performing and working on activities that are part of the overall plan. But they also need to ensure that in some way, shape, or form, they provide some level of mentoring, that they provide additional guidance and coaching to the team. If it is a Scrum approach, it's no longer a project manager, but a Scrum master. But they too have a role to ensure that the processes themselves within the Scrum framework and the way the team is working are clear and well established. And if not, some of their responsibilities are to ensure that there's continuous improvement around those processes, to coach and mentor the team as well. And then within every team, there needs to be a sense of growth. As we will see later when we talk about motivation, one of the key extrinsic motivators is around growth and development. People need to be able to become more than they are, to gain skills, and to have a sense of accomplishment as they're working towards not only the project, but their own career. One of the key outcomes of the team performance domain is the establishment of a common culture or a team culture. And again, I will turn your attention to the exercise that we did early on in our course, where within your teams, you were asked to establish team norms. That exercise was undertaken specifically to allow you early on in the development of your team some sense of shared beliefs and a focus on the types of ways the team would work and collaborate together, how they would manage conflict, how they would share information, how they would resolve problems, and other aspects. So, again, think back to that exercise with respect to your team norms and try to understand the importance of that exercise. And are there any areas where you and your team may have stumbled with respect to, really establishing and then living those norms? And what was their impact on your project, the success or some of the challenges you may have faced during the planning and execution of that project? So when we talk about team culture, the project team culture reflects the project team's individual ways of working and interacting. The project manager is critical to establishing and maintaining a safe, respectful, and non-judgmental environment. Now, that puts a lot of onus on the project manager. They need to lead by example. They are the project leader. But it is also important for all of the team members to understand that they have a role in providing that safe space, those respectful actions within the group setting. The environment is, in and of itself, critical to ensuring there's collaboration and open communication. Collaboration and open communication ensure that the best ideas are at least surfaced, that there is some sense of safety across the team members to express their opinions, and that allows for diversity of thought. So the project manager themselves, but also every single team member, should ensure that they have and provide transparency, i.e., share information as to why they're making certain decisions and why those decisions matter. They need to have integrity, the whole notion of not just do as I say, but, I have to also have those same types of core values myself. But I can't just ask team members to perform and behave in a certain way, but then not live up to those expectations myself. They need to show respect. They need to ensure that there's positive discourse, provide support to their team members, have courage, meaning sometimes there are very difficult decisions that need to be made in the course of a project, and they need to be able to be certain that those decisions are the right decisions and to undertake them, but also to, at the end, or even throughout the project itself, celebrate successes. Studies show that there is a strong link between project teams, culture, and project success. Organizational team culture is like cultures of different countries. There's a set of shared beliefs and norms and values, assumptions. These could be written or unwritten that define many aspects of communication and problem solving, interactions, and team dynamics. There are 10 primary characteristics, and those include member identity, team emphasis, i.e., the whole notion there is no I in team, and that the team must work as one, management focus, integration, control, risk tolerance, reward criteria, conflict tolerance, means versus end orientation, and an open systems focus. So how does one identify cultural characteristics within an organization, or even if we drill down and go down a little bit more to the micro level at the team level? And the question is, well, why is this important? As I have mentioned at times in my class, when interviewing team members or in interviews myself, I always try to make sure that students understand that the interview process should not be one-sided, i.e., if you're being interviewed for a particular role, it's also important that you try to understand the type of culture you yourself would be working within. And if you're working within a project team, it's important to try to understand how the culture may be defined or how it's evolving. And it's not so much that you can yourself sometimes affect or change the culture, but because are, projects are a product of their culture and their environment, they are influenced. And although you may not be able to change the environment in which the project is being undertaken, understanding and reading through the type of project culture that may be present allows you to, at the very least, incorporate and balance out some of the positive and or negative aspects of culture. For example, let's just assume that the culture within or the environment within which the project is being undertaken is one that is typically risk averse, meaning that the organization itself may not tolerate error, or there's a fear that error will not be tolerated. In this case, with individuals that are risk averse and working within this type of environment, they may play it safe. And so you may have, for example, with respect to risk, um, and for example, coming up with project estimates around time and the number of resources or costs, people in the group team members may tend to overestimate the amount of time or dollars that it costs for the time that it takes to get work done. And so your project timelines or your costs become bloated because of that presence of risk and people's lack of faith in taking some risk or not wanting to make mistake. Also, if the team culture emphasizes individual performance rather than team performance, then some of the ways that the team members collaborate and how they share and communicate amongst each other is not going to be team oriented, but sort of individual oriented. So, what are some ways that you might be able to identify and start to understand some of the cultural elements that are present? Well, you can study the physical characteristics of an organization if you have an opportunity. For example, they may say that there's an open communication policy or the manager's door is always open, meaning there is the ability to, openly communicate uh, with your director or VP on any project issues. But you walk in and the doors are often closed, and people tend not to engage with each other, particularly with those that might be at a higher level within the organizational hierarchy. Or people have cubicles with high walls. If you walk into an area that is, let's say, agile focused, you may find that there are no cubicles, that people sit at open desks so that those communication channels are always open. People can collaborate in real time. You can read about the organization itself. What are its values? What does it focus in on? Sometimes those are well published, and you can also get a sense from news stories, issues that may have occurred within the organization. You can observe how people interact with each other within the organization. And you can also try to interpret stories and folklore surrounding the organization. There are always stories to be told about how someone may have or may not have been successful in an endeavor, and the outcomes that came about. There's a story that I often tell students around my previous work environments where there were certain words and phrases that were part of the norm, and they didn't mean much to me. But as I dug a little bit deeper and tried to understand what these phrases were, it really led me to believe that for those individuals that had been there and they'd been there for a while, there was a strong sense of belonging because they were tied through certain ways of interacting, or stories of the past, these common phrases that were used, and so forth. So here's another point where I want you to be able to reflect. Let's have a retrospective. If you had challenges within your project teams, can you identify which of the above or lack thereof contributed to those challenges? What could you do differently? What do you commit to doing in the future to foster a strong collaborative environment for your project team to succeed? This is not the only time within your schooling that you're going to be working within teams. And you're certainly going to be working within project teams as you move into your role as a business analyst and eventually a project manager. So, characteristics of high performing teams include open communication, shared understanding, shared ownership, trust amongst the team members, strong collaboration, adaptability, resilience, empowerment, and recognition. And again, the intention of the exercise in establishing team norms was to try to build on some of these concepts. It wasn't going to happen immediately. And some of you may not have appreciated the importance of what we were trying to achieve. It may have just been seen as an exercise, as part of your schoolwork without kind of understanding the objective. Even though it was talked about in class, sometimes those lessons don't really become apparent until you are actually in your project teams and start to recognize, and this might be the point where, for example, you struggled in getting work accomplished or meeting deadlines for certain deliverables on your project because of the lack of collaboration between team members. Or maybe there wasn't a shared understanding as to what the project was trying to achieve. There wasn't shared ownership around the project because individuals didn't see the project in the same way. Some maybe saw it as a learning opportunity and wanted to go a little bit deeper, and others may not have seen the project as anything more than something to get done, to be able to maximize a mark and move on. And when you have, for example, in that very simple example, when you have that type of dichotomy amongst team members, it really makes it difficult for them to be able to get onto the same page, which leads to conflict. And then you need aspects of trust amongst each other to be able to resolve conflict. Often within the project itself, there may have been hurdles, challenges that you faced. How easy were you able to adapt to those changing conditions? Did you have the resilience, the grit to be able to get through those challenges? And there are always going to be challenges within projects. And so the ability of the project leader and the teams themselves to be able to get through those challenges, to be able to move forward when things seem difficult and are difficult, is really important in achieving project outcomes. Now let's talk about organizational structures, specifically functional, project, and matrix organizational structures. The way that the team members themselves are drawn into the project and where they sit in the hierarchy and the focus of the individual's role within the hierarchy does affect many aspects of project execution. There are advantages and disadvantages with each organizational structure specific to the project. And again, it's not something that project managers are going to be able to change. The organizational structure is what it is within organizations. But if you can understand, again, the elements of those organizational structures and how they may influence project planning and delivery, then again, it's about trying to balance out those elements or maximize the advantages of each organizational structure when it comes to the planning and successful delivery of your particular project. So, how will the project be implemented? And again, I stress the project is a product of its environment. So, to answer the question, we can examine three different project management structures used by organizations to implement projects. Those are one, functional, two, project, and three, matrix. So, what are some of the challenges of managing projects in an organization? So, there's sort of two key areas to focus in on. One, our projects contradict fundamental design principles. That being, projects are unique, one-time efforts with definite beginning and end. But most organizations are designed to manage ongoing activities. We talked about project versus operational undertakings early on in our course. Complex tasks are decomposed into simplified, repetitive activities. But projects are by their nature not routine. Another area of challenges, projects are multidisciplinary and require coordinated efforts of a variety of specialists to be completed. Most organizations are structured by departments aligned to functional expertise, i.e. engineers and engineering departments and marketing specialists and marketing departments and so on. And there's also a question, who oversees the projects? An authority in most organizations is vertical, meaning it's not across functional lines. So let's look at projects that are undertaken in a functional organization. So the first question is, well, what is a functional organization? And for these various examples, the core idea of a functional organization is present, but there are some key differences. In a functional organization, more or less, they're not set up with projects specifically in mind. So they're not tailored to the efficiency of the delivery of projects. But it doesn't mean that projects are not executed in these types of environments. Of course they are. But what often happens is that the project may have an origin within a specific element of or department within the organization itself. Maybe there's an idea within marketing to sell particular products, but it requires some support from IT or the engineering department, and maybe there's some procurement elements that might be involved, or HR or finance. But the project has its genesis within that particular functional area. And often the individual that is tasked with executing the delivery of that particular project or that outcome is not a project management specialist. In fact, they probably are not project management focused. They may or may not have project management background. And there may not be a focus, and often isn't, on project management activities. So there may not be a program or project management office within the organization that has established processes and procedures for good project management or standardize those processes within the organization. There may not be templates that can be utilized, for example, a common template for project charters. There may not be a common project management life cycle. So there may not be any structure to the projects themselves. And often the individuals are just tasked to, perform some sort of special assignment, but it's a project. And so within this type of organization, some of the things to kind of note, and they're highlighted on the next set of slides, is that there are some challenges that the project manager, and I use that in quotations, may face. One, how they have resources allocated to certain elements of the project. Well, those are usually delegated to the other areas within the organization. So there may not be necessarily a good centralized point of command. There is again, somebody that's kind of overseeing these elements, but they lose some of the control and the execution of that. And it's also very difficult to communicate and make decisions because in this type of organizational structure, there needs to be, there is followed protocols around how decisions are made. They're run up the ladder, the chain. So if something needs to be decided at lower levels of marketing and it involves some other areas within, let's say, the engineering department, well, that information has to sort of travel up through the hierarchy, and depending on how important the decision is or how much it affects the organization, also determines how far up it may have to go. And then, that sort of goes across the functional area into the other department, and then at the sort of at the peer level, and then it follows all the way down. And then certain decisions or outcomes are made, and those may have to follow the chain upwards again and across and back down again. When I worked within the college, as I've talked about in the course before, on the BYOD project itself, I worked within a functional organization. I was part of the academic excellence unit within the college, and we were tasked with, you know, building out this BYOD program for each of the courses and programs at the college. But it involved work from areas of IT, from the infrastructure teams, the electrical department and the facilities departments as well. We had to work with the library system and marketing. So there was a lot of different areas that we were involved with. And I had to understand that when developing some of these project timelines, that additional time would be required because decisions move slowly, allocation of resources was not dedicated to the project. And what that means was people really just had their operational focus, and any tasks that they needed to perform with respect to the project were kind of additional tasks above and beyond what they had in a normal workday. And those usually were not their priority because they weren't really, by definition, tasks that were part of their overall job description, their roles and responsibilities. They were not measured in terms of performance and success. If they had some type of objectives for the year, or performance evaluations were not based on how well they performed these particular tasks, and so they wouldn't allocate time, and if they did, it was usually secondary to these particular projects. They did the work, but if something's not a priority for individuals, it tends to move slower. Anytime I had to engage a new set of resources for elements of the project that required a skill set, I had to go through the process of engaging with my manager and over to their manager to be able to allocate some time to the particular project. So that meant that they weren't dedicated as well, and they were only kind of working on project activities when requested. So you can imagine that there are some challenges when it comes to trying to execute projects in this type of environment where one, you don't have a dedicated program office, two, dedicated resources to a particular project, three, individuals that are managing these projects and people that are working on these particular projects are not well versed in project management practices, and so it's very difficult to apply these types of um, tried and tested methods and best practices to executing projects successfully, and some other areas of concern. provided a lot of information in the previous slide, but I want to try to summarize some of the key aspects of functional organizations so that you have them front and center. So as a summary, projects managed within the functional hierarchy of the organization. 2. Different part or segments of the project are delegated to respective functional units. 3. Each unit is responsible for managing and completing its segment of the project. 4. Coordination is maintained through normal management channels. 5. Commonly used when one functional area plays a dominant role in completing the project. And 6. Some person high ranking within that area may be given the task of coordinating the project, but they're not, as I mentioned, the project manager. So the advantages and disadvantages of functional organizations. Well, some of the advantages are that there's no change. There's no radical redesign of the company required. There's flexibility in terms of the use of staff. So even though staff members may not be dedicated to the project and have the project as their primary focus, you can tailor the type of skills that are required to the project and temporarily assign them only when you need them. That is a bit of an advantage because it doesn't come with a high cost of having dedicated project team members that may or may not be engaged at every element of the project. They're used when required only. And that also leads to the ability to really garner like in-depth expertise. So if the scope of the project is narrow, then in-depth expertise can be brought to bear on the most crucial aspects. And there's an easy transition, meaning, remember, projects have a beginning and end. That was one of the common sort of definitions or attributes of a project. So the question becomes is, well, what happens when the project ends? Well, there really isn't any difficulty transitioning from a project to kind of normal operations because we haven't really affected the organizational structure and the people within it significantly. You have normal career paths that are maintained for individuals because, again, it's their operational work within their functional area that takes precedence. And all of the professional development and growth is within that particular department. Doesn't seem very significant in terms of advantages. Disadvantages, though, from a project perspective, is there's a lack of focus. Each functional unit has its own core routine work to do, and that means different priorities for different units. There's poor integration across the team members and the specialists. They're only concerned with their own primary objectives, so not necessarily the project objectives. It's slower in terms of planning and execution of activities. Slow response times, information is circulated through normal channels, there's no direct communication. And because there's a lack of ownership with respect to the project, motivation is often weak, the project is seen as an additional burden, and because it's not directly linked to their objectives, there isn't a focus. There isn't a single shared vision and common ownership around the project itself. So now let's turn our attention to project management structures, projectized project management, or the projectized organizational structure. So again, a lot of things stay the same here, but on the right-hand side, what you notice is there is a dedicated project team. Now, there might be multiple project teams for multiple projects, but the key idea here is that it's dedicated. So it's almost diametrically sort of different than the functional organization. We have units that are specifically designed to be focused on the project itself. And within that project team, there are individuals that are dedicated to the project itself for the course of the project. Often these resources may be drawn from their home units or their home areas. And so if the project requires unique and specialized skills for that particular project, from let's say marketing, finance, or procurement, an individual or multiple engineer individuals, depending on the scope and the amount of work, could be seconded from their home teams and then they are working 100% on project activities. There's a project manager or project director, again, depending on the complexity here. It kind of just shows that it's very sort of simple project manager, but there could be a whole project team and infrastructure and hierarchy dedicated to the project if it's fairly complex and long term. But there is the key message here is there is one person that is project specialized, or a team of individuals that are project specialized in executing the project, coordinating the project activities, and there's going to be a stronger sense of project. So there are definitely advantages and disadvantages. And I think if we look at what were some of the disadvantages and advantages of a functional organization, we can almost swap those. In this case, some of the advantages, and we'll look at those in a little bit more detail shortly, but some of the advantages are this time there is a focus on the project. The project is the priority for these individuals. They're not also burdened by additional project activities on top of their operational activities. The project activities are their sole responsibility, and therefore their performance plans and their objectives for the year are set in and around the project. So they have focus and motivation to ensure that the project is successfully completed, since their performance for the year may be evaluated around the success of the project itself and their role within the project and how well they performed. So there's that advantage. There's also advantages of speed in this case. Projects are typically executed faster because of the focus on the project. Decisions are made within the project team itself and the hierarchy of the project. You no longer have to run decisions up the flagpole and across, um, and back down again to certain areas and wait for those decisions to be made. And because again, people are focused and working 100% on project activities, well, that means they have more time to work on those activities. So they're not going to take longer. They're not just working on it 5 or 10% of the time, and therefore elongating the project duration. So let's move in and look at this in a little bit more detail. So on the other end of the spectrum from functional is this creation, as I mentioned, of an independent and dedicated project team. It operates as a separate unit from the parent organization. There's a dedicated full-time project manager. It pulls together a group of specialists that work full-time on the project. The recruitment of resources is both from internal and external sources. So that means that whatever resources are seconded from the internal functional teams, the team may be augmented with additional resources through contracts or kind of shorter duration stints, procurement of those resources from outside of the organization. And that could be because we don't necessarily have and the ability to pull from the functional teams to the extent of the resources that we require. And so we may have to go and get those resources, or maybe there are shorter durations. So those types of resources within the overall organization are not going to be there for a long time, and therefore it doesn't make sense to pull from somewhere else. It's just more cost effective. And as I mentioned, you can have multiple independent project teams for individual projects. So you could have 3 or 4 or 5 different specialized and unique project teams for different projects. A closer look at the advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages is that it's simple. Functional teams are a source of resources, but otherwise they remain intact, and the project operates independently. The project gets executed faster. Projects are completed faster because there's full-time participation of resources. Response times are quicker, decisions are made internally within the project. It's cohesive. Participants share a common goal. They have a personal responsibility towards the project. And integration. Resources from different areas work closely together to optimize the project itself and not their respective areas of expertise. But the disadvantages are as follows. It is more expensive. Why? Because resources are assigned on a full-time basis, even if they're not required full-time. So what that means is that project activities ebb and flow. And you may have business analysts that are integral to the success of the project. But if you have this type of waterfall approach to projects, it means that maybe the business analysts are engaged uh, closer to 100% early on in the project when we are defining the project itself, the project scope, so through the requirements. But then they may not be fully engaged, not that they're not working on activities when the project is kind of going through design and development, right? Like business analysts may be required to work on the testing plans and to ensure that that there is that alignment of requirements to testing outcomes. They may not be involved 100% of the time, or their involvement kind of decreases a little bit. So at the end of the day, those resources are still part of the project. They're there. It doesn't make sense to send them back, pull them back in. I mean, the whole idea is that they're part of a dedicated team. So you have a loss of economies of scale, and you're also creating new positions, project manager, or you may even have a project director with multiple project managers, depending on the scope of the project within that single sort of area. So there are new rules, and therefore it's a little bit more expensive to the organization. There could be internal strife, a strong sense of we that develops and leads to the divisiveness between the project organization itself, or the parent organization, sorry, and the project team. So those that are working on a project maybe see themselves as unique and special. They're working on this important endeavor within the organization, and that could lead to a little bit of again divisiveness between their home team and the people that were there, that they work with, and now are not sort of part of their, at least for a temporary amount of time. They're not together sort of as a single unit. It does limit expertise. So technical expertise is limited to the talents and the experience of those that are assigned to the project. And you can't just grow the project team and decrease the project team at whim. And again, because projects are temporary endeavors, the question is, well, what do you do with the resources when the project is complete? Those that were external are let go, so they have contracts, but their contracts expire and are closed out at the end of the project. But more importantly is we have individuals from within the organization that were seconded, and maybe it was a 5 month project, maybe it was a year project. The project that I'm working on currently at the university is 4 or 5 year project, and many resources were seconded from their home teams. When the project is complete, they're going to go back, but they may go back to an area that is not familiar to them. In 4 or 5 years' time, managers change, colleagues change, their roles and responsibilities may have changed. And so there's that difficulty, that transition for the organization and the project team member. And last, we'll look at the matrix organizational structure, which is basically a hybrid of the functional and the fully projectized organizational structure. And depending on how much it leans to one or the other, you may have what we call a weak matrix, a balanced matrix, and a strong matrix organizational structure. So weak matrix structure, as we go through sort of the characteristics of one, we'll see what that matters is, but it leans more towards functional. And a strong matrix organization leans more towards a projectized organization. And a balanced one is exactly what it sort of entails. It's kind of right, sort of in the balance of the functional and the projectized organizational structure. So again, we have the same type of organizational structure as before with HR, finance, marketing, engineering, manufacturing, procurement, and so on. But you may have a specialized and dedicated program office. And so there might be a director of projects or a director of the program office or some sort of hierarchy overseeing the multiple projects. And within that project management office, there could be and are multiple project managers. Because there is a project management office, again, there's standardized approaches to planning and executing projects, the common project management life cycle. There are tools and templates and processes, ways of working that are established. And what happens is that what I'm trying to show here is that each of the resources that are performing on a particular project are brought in and tailored towards that project. And so you might have project manager A that is working on project A, project manager B working on project B, project manager C working on project C, and so on. And each project has a unique scope and requires a unique set of resources and skills and number of resources. And so what you might see here, for example, is project A requires one FTE full-time equivalent from the HR department and one from finance, two from marketing, one from engineering, one from manufacturing, two from procurement. Now, we say, and I deliberately use the word full-time equivalent because it doesn't necessarily have to be one resource, one person that fulfills that entire role. It might be made up of 3 or 4 individuals working a percentage of their time that equals to that one FTE equivalent. And so the HR role maybe requires a billing specialist, a payroll specialist, and some other areas of HR. And that means it's not just one person that may or may not have all those skills. We can say that we need 0.25% of this particular resource with that skill, another 0.5% of another resource over the course of the project with another skill from HR, and another 0.25% of someone's time with another skill set from HR. And so we've tailored the skills to the project needs without having to actually have 3 individuals assigned to the project that are working on it, a portion of the time, like they would in the projectized organization, because they're needed for certain parts of the project, but not on a full-time basis. But that was where the cost was coming in, it was a lot higher. And so that's why you can have like a half a resource on project C from the HR department. And they're tailored towards the needs of the project, the number of resources and the skills. Now, these individuals still reside in their functional units. So they don't report to the project manager um, directly or through sort of formal authority. They have their functional unit managers that, for all intents and purposes, oversee their, day-to-day management when it comes to sort of operational things. They may even still be working on operational activities and not dedicated to projects 100% of the time. So again, like in functional, they have specific day-to-day work that they need to execute, but a dedicated piece of their time is assigned to projects. And so at least that gives them some focus and dedication and alignment with project and project outcomes. So you can really kind of tailor the allocation of resources and the skills towards the project and on a temporary basis, given that projects are temporary. These individuals never leave their functional unit, so they're not reallocated and reassigned and report into the project manager for all of their day-to-day work. They still have that oversight, but they are potentially assigned to one or more projects, which means, and we'll talk about some of the disadvantages, which means they could have, again, for all intents and purposes, 2 or 3 managers. Because when assigned to the project, even though they may not be directly assigned to the project manager and they have authority in general over them, like their performance, their evaluations, their promotions, things like that, approval of sick days, approval of vacation days, like that still resides with their home manager. But the project manager does direct some of their day-to-day work with respect to project activities. So they effectively do have another boss. They could have 2 bosses, 3 bosses. And so there's some advantages here where they're pulled in multiple directions and they're working on multiple projects. And also project managers want to ensure that they have the best resources on their projects. And so there's often a competition for resources. They want certain individuals to be on their project given past performance and their comfort and knowledge level of that resource's ability to perform work, their focus, their motivation. So it makes sense that these resources and how they're allocated and the use of their time is very much driven by and really sort of competed for by project managers. So what we have here, as I mentioned, is a hybrid model. The project structure is overlaid on the normal functional hierarchy. There could be two or more chains of command along with the functional lines and the long project lines. So two or more bosses. Again, typically individuals are working on multiple projects, not a single project in addition to their home team. It's designed to optimize resources, as I mentioned. Individuals can work on multiple projects and also perform normal functional duties. And the three types, the weak, the balanced, and the strong, as I mentioned earlier. So let's think a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages given the description and also comparison to the other two types of organizational structural models. So the advantages, as I mentioned, it's efficient because resources are shared across multiple projects and you reduce duplication. There's a strong focus. A project manager is dedicated and responsible for coordinating and integrating the teams and their activities. There's an easier transition when the project ends because, well, the team members maintain ties to their teams, their overall functional teams. And there's flexibility in the utilization of resources and the expertise within the organization. As we saw, you can tailor how much of an individual's time and when they're required for particular projects. And other times, they may be allocated to other projects. So they're not fully dedicated or their time is not fully sucked up by the project as it might be in a projectized organization. But some of the disadvantages that you need to be mindful of are the following. There's conflict, there's tension between the functional and the project managers because there's conflicting agendas. The project manager is focused on the project, the functional manager is focused on the functional duties, and sometimes there is um, definitely some conflict between those two agendas and the accountability. There could be infighting, as I mentioned, sharing of resources over periods of time leads to fighting to secure resources based on priority as well as the best resources and competition for those scarce resources. It's stressful for the individual team members because they have to report to two or more managers. They have conflicting priorities as well. And in theory, it should be faster, but in practice, it's slower. Now, that's relative slower to the projectized organization, but it is definitely quicker than some elements of the functional organization. And again, it depends on how it leans. If it leans more towards the strong matrix organization, then it's closer to projectized, and therefore it's a little bit quicker. But there still are some challenges here because resources are being shared. It's very difficult to anticipate 2, 3, 4 months from now how those resources are required, but we do our best. And when the time comes, we may find that there is a lot of priority that kind of slows down or conflict and priority that slows down some project activities at particular points in the project. And then you do have to negotiate decisions across multiple project teams. Now let's wrap up with a closer look at roles and responsibilities. A project team will include people with different skill sets, personalities, and operation styles. Success requires that you and the project team members agree on how to work with each other to maximize contribution, minimize wasted time, and mistakes. Does that sound familiar, given your project and your project teams for this particular course? Question is, what are each team member's commitments? And what are each team member's roles and responsibilities? And it's very important to define these well and to make sure that people agree to the roles that they play and the responsibilities that come with those roles. Definitions of authority, responsibility, and accountability. Authority is the ability to make final binding decisions about the project. Responsibility is the commitment to achieve a specific result. And accountability is bringing consequence to bear in response to people's performance. So with those things in mind, here's an example of a responsibility assignment matrix, basically a tool that's used to ensure that we understand what specific tasks, and these are drawn from the WBS, are the primary responsibility of a particular individual or team, who might have secondary responsibility, who has authority in terms of making decisions or approval of the completion of activity or decisions with respect to that activity. And so what you might have here is on the left-hand side, all of the project management activities, the decomposed work, and the work packages that show up on your WBS, on your Microsoft project plan or your big picture plan. And then from the team members or the various team members, project manager, team member one, team member two, and so on, who is responsible for performing or has primary responsibility for that particular task. If somebody has a secondary responsibility, and who provides the approval. There's different variations of this. There's also a RACI chart that depicts responsibility, accountability, who's consulted and who's informed with respect to certain project activities or roles that are played within the project itself. So just an idea of how you might organize and show responsibility across project activities. And finally, some steps in developing a responsibility assignment matrix. First, identify all the people who will participate and support your project. Develop a complete list of deliverables. Discuss with all team members how each of them will support the work to produce the project deliverables. Prepare an initial RAM draft, review, and approve. If there's a lack of approval from one or more of the team members, revise, review, and approve. And repeat step 5 and continue the process until the approval form or the approval is received from all of the team members across the project. How well did you do? Again, with respect to your own projects, was it clear what activities and deliverables were needed? Who was working on them? And did they agree? Was it clear in that they have, you know, their own input into the work? And was it clear on what they were expected to do? Is this an area where there's some challenges? And what can you do going forward?